I grew up believing my father was the safest person in my life. He was calm, respected, and admired by everyone who met him. Neighbors trusted him, relatives praised him, and people often told me how lucky I was to have such a strong father. From the outside, our family looked stable and loving, the kind of home where nothing bad could happen. That image stayed intact for years, even as something inside me slowly began to feel wrong. Inside the house, control didn't come with shouting or violence. It came quietly, hidden inside concern and wrapped in the language of protection. He wanted to know where I was going, who I was talking to, why I needed privacy. At first it felt normal, even caring. He said the world was dangerous and that he was only trying to keep me safe. I believed him, because daughters are taught to trust their fathers before they trust their own instincts. As I grew older, his questions turned into expectations, and his expectations turned into rules I was never allowed to question. I began adjusting my behavior without being asked, avoiding certain people, censoring my words, planning my life around his approval. I didn't realize it then, but fear had slowly replaced trust, and obedience had started to feel like survival. Everything changed the day I told him I wanted to move out. I was working, earning my own money, and finally imagining a life that belonged to me. I spoke calmly and respectfully because I still wanted his approval. I told him I needed independence and space to grow. He listened quietly, nodded, and then smiled in a way that immediately made me uneasy. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was confidence, as if he already knew how the conversation would end. He asked me to sit down and began speaking softly, almost kindly. Then he mentioned something from my past, something deeply personal that I had trusted him with years ago. He reminded me of details no one else knew and told me he had proof, messages and records that could change how people saw me forever. My heart dropped as I realized he wasn't reminding me out of concern. He was warning me. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself he would never actually do something like that. I reminded him that he was my father, that families don't hurt each other this way. He didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply said that if I left, people would know everything, and that he didn't want to hurt me. He just wanted me to stay. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't love or protection anymore. It was control. From that day on, every decision I made felt watched. What I wore, where I went, who I spoke to, even what I posted online. At family gatherings, he would sit beside me, smiling proudly, while people praised him as a devoted father. I smiled too, knowing that one word from him could unravel my entire life. The world saw a caring parent. I felt like a prisoner. The hardest part wasn't the fear itself, but the loneliness of knowing that the person who was supposed to protect me was the one holding my future hostage. I stayed silent because I knew no one would believe me. And just when I thought I could survive by enduring it quietly, something happened that forced me to choose between my freedom and my silence. After that day, nothing in my life felt spontaneous anymore. Every decision passed through an invisible filter of fear, because I knew there was always a consequence waiting if I disappointed him. He didn't need to remind me often. Just a look, a pause in his voice, or a casual mention of the past was enough to keep me in line. Control doesn't need constant threats when it's already been planted deep enough. He began inserting himself into parts of my life he had never cared about before. He wanted to know my work schedule, my friends' names, the people I talked to online. If I hesitated or gave short answers, he'd calmly remind me how easily misunderstandings spread and how fragile reputations can be. He spoke as if he was offering wisdom, but every sentence carried the same message. I was only free as long as I obeyed. The worst part was how normal he made it feel. At breakfast, he'd ask about my day like any other father. At dinner, he'd joke, laugh, and tell stories. Then, when no one else was around, he'd quietly question a choice I made, or suggest a change that wasn't really a suggestion. If I resisted, he never argued. He simply let the silence stretch long enough for fear to do the work for him. I started living two lives at once, one where I smiled, functioned, and pretended everything was fine, and another where every thought was weighed carefully before being spoken out loud. I stopped trusting my own reactions because I was constantly calculating outcomes. I wasn't asking myself what I wanted anymore. I was asking myself what would keep me safe. There were moments when I almost convinced myself this was normal, that maybe all parents did this and I was just being dramatic. But then he would bring up the proof again, casually, like it was a safety net he kept folded in his pocket. He never showed it to me, because he didn't need to. Knowing it existed was enough to keep me awake at night. I tried to create distance by staying out longer, limiting conversations, finding excuses to be away from home. He noticed immediately. One evening, he calmly asked if I was planning something without telling him. His tone wasn't angry, just curious. And somehow that made it worse. I denied it, even though the truth was I was desperately looking for a way out. The pressure started affecting everything. My work suffered because I couldn't focus. My friendships faded because I was afraid of saying too much. I felt like I was shrinking, becoming smaller just to fit inside the boundaries he had drawn for me. The world kept moving forward, but I was stuck, frozen in a life that wasn't mine. What hurt the most was realizing that this wasn't about protection or concern. It was about power. He needed to know that no matter how old I got or how independent I became, he still had the final say. I wasn't his daughter in those moments. I was leverage. And just when I thought I could survive by staying quiet and invisible, something unexpected happened. Someone noticed the change in me, asked the wrong question, and unknowingly set off a chain of events that my father could no longer fully control. That was the moment I realized silence was no longer protecting me, and the cost of staying might be greater than the risk of leaving. For the first time since everything started, I allowed myself to imagine a life where he no longer had control over me. It wasn't hope yet, more like a dangerous thought I kept pushing away. But it refused to disappear. The more I stayed silent, the more I realized that obedience wasn't keeping me safe. It was slowly erasing me. I started paying attention to the details I had ignored before, the way he always spoke in general terms when he reminded me of the past. The fact that he never actually showed me the proof he claimed to have. The way his confidence depended entirely on my fear. That realization was small, but it was enough to make me question whether his power was as absolute as I believed. I began testing the boundaries carefully, making tiny changes that were almost invisible. I stayed out a little longer. I delayed responses. I shared less. Each time I waited for the consequences, expecting everything to collapse. But nothing happened. He noticed, of course. He always noticed, but instead of confronting me, he adjusted his tone, becoming softer, more watchful, as if he sensed something shifting. At the same time, the pressure inside me was building. Living under constant control had taught me to overthink every word, every action. I couldn't relax. I couldn't trust anyone fully. Even moments of happiness felt temporary, like they could be taken away at any second. I realized that even if I stayed forever, I would never feel free. I would just grow older inside the same invisible cage. I started documenting everything, not because I knew what I would do with it, but because I needed proof that this was real. I wrote down dates, conversations, the exact words he used when he reminded me of my past. Seeing it written made it harder to minimize what was happening. This wasn't discipline, this wasn't care, this was manipulation, carefully maintained over time. The most painful realization came when I understood why it worked for so long. He wasn't controlling me because he hated me. He was controlling me because he needed to feel important, powerful, and necessary. As long as I was dependent on his silence, he felt relevant in my life. Letting go of control would mean facing his own emptiness, and he wasn't ready for that. I reached out to someone I trusted, not to tell the whole story, but to test whether my voice still worked. I spoke carefully, leaving out names, leaving out details. Even that felt terrifying. But instead of judgment, I received concern. Real concern. For the first time, I felt seen, and that scared me almost as much as it comforted me. From that moment on, I knew there was no going back to pretending. Whether I stayed or left, something was going to break. The only question was whether it would be me or the control he had built around my fear. And as I quietly prepared for what came next, I had no idea how violently he would react when he realized he was losing his grip. The moment he realized something had changed, everything became heavier. His calm turned sharper, his questions more precise, and his presence felt impossible to escape. He didn't accuse me directly, but I could feel him watching, measuring every word I said and every move I made, as if he was trying to figure out how much control he still had left. One evening, he asked me to sit down again, the same chair, the same quiet tone. But this time there was no softness in his eyes. He told me he felt distance between us and asked if I was hiding something. I denied it, because fear had trained me to lie smoothly, but I knew he didn't believe me. He reminded me once again of the past, of how fragile reputations are, of how quickly stories spread when people want them to. That night, he finally showed me what he had been holding over my head all these years. Screenshots, messages taken out of context, old conversations frozen in time, stripped of explanations. Seeing them in front of me made my hands shake, not because they were as powerful as he claimed, but because I realized how carefully he had saved them. This wasn't impulse. This was preparation. He told me that if I tried to leave, if I tried to speak to anyone, if I tried to paint him as the villain, he would make sure I regretted it. He said it calmly, like he was explaining rules to a child. He said no one would believe me anyway, because he was respected and I was emotional. Hearing that hurt more than the threat itself, because I knew how true it sounded. For the first time, I spoke back. Not loudly, not angrily, but firmly. I told him he was wrong, that I wasn't a child anymore, that he couldn't own my life forever. The room went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. That was the moment I knew I had crossed a line he never expected me to cross. The days that followed were unbearable. He alternated between cold silence and forced normalcy, acting like nothing was wrong in front of others while tightening control in private. I barely slept. Every notification on my phone felt like a threat. Every conversation felt like a potential disaster. I was living in constant anticipation of impact. But fear had started changing shape. It wasn't paralyzing anymore. It was sharpening my focus. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. Staying meant slowly disappearing, piece by piece. Leaving meant chaos, but it also meant the possibility of freedom. And for the first time, freedom felt worth the risk. I began preparing quietly, knowing that once I made my move, there would be no turning back. What I didn't realize was that he was preparing too, and that the final confrontation would force both of us to face truths neither of us could escape. The confrontation didn't happen the way I imagined it would. There was no shouting, no dramatic exposure, no moment where everything suddenly became easy. Instead, it came quietly, after weeks of pressure, when I realized that waiting for the perfect moment was just another way of staying trapped. I understood that freedom wasn't going to feel safe when it arrived. It was going to feel terrifying. I left without asking permission. I didn't announce it or explain myself. I packed only what I needed and walked out knowing that whatever happened next would be irreversible. For the first time in years, my fear wasn't about what he might do. It was about whether I could survive standing on my own. That fear felt different. It felt honest. When the fallout came, it was exactly as he promised and nothing like he predicted. He tried to control the narrative, reaching out to people, hinting at my instability, implying that I had abandoned my family for selfish reasons. But something unexpected happened. The stories didn't land the way he thought they would. People asked questions. Details didn't add up. The power he relied on wasn't as solid outside the walls of our house. I didn't fight him publicly. I didn't expose everything at once. I chose something he never expected: distance, silence, boundaries. I shared my truth only where it mattered, with people who listened instead of judged. Without my fear feeding him, his control weakened. Without my obedience, his leverage meant less than he believed. The hardest part wasn't leaving. It was rebuilding my sense of self after years of being told who I was allowed to be. I had to learn how to make decisions without asking permission, how to trust my instincts again, how to exist without anticipating punishment. Healing wasn't fast or neat, but it was real. My relationship with my father never returned to what it was, and it never should have. Some damage doesn't get repaired. It gets acknowledged and left behind. I don't hate him. I don't excuse him either. I understand now that control often comes from fear, but understanding doesn't mean accepting it. What I gained wasn't revenge or closure in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and more powerful. Ownership of my life, the ability to choose without fear, the freedom to walk away from anyone, even family, who believes love gives them the right to control you. And if there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that obedience can keep you safe for a while, but only courage gives you a future. What you have just heard is not only the end of this story, it is my judgment, and it is also the judgment of the one who lived it. As an ancient scholar, I have seen many forms of power disguised as virtue. Control often hides behind responsibility, and fear often wears the mask of love. When a parent believes authority gives them ownership, the bond that should protect becomes a prison that slowly destroys the soul beneath it. The character in this story has already delivered their judgment through action. By choosing distance, by choosing silence, by choosing freedom, they declared that love without respect is not love at all. Walking away was not revenge. It was a verdict. My judgment is simple and final. A parent's duty is to prepare a child for independence, not to punish them for seeking it. Any authority that survives only through fear has already failed. Control may last for years, but it collapses the moment courage replaces obedience. To those listening who recognize their own lives in this story, understand this clearly. You are not betraying anyone by choosing yourself. You are not ungrateful for setting boundaries, and you are not wrong for breaking invisible chains that were never meant to exist. Some judgments do not need shouting or exposure. Some are delivered quietly, through distance, dignity, and self-respect. This was one of them. This is my judgment, and this is where the story ends.